All right, folks, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't helped yourself to some snacks, please do. We have a cornucopia over there. Thank you to Pat and Isabella. Thank you very much. And Jobs with Justice also brought some refreshments. There's a Jobs with Justice sign-in sheet if you're interested in more about Jobs with Justice over here. And also, I want to thank Pat. Also, we should thank, because Pat pulled all of this together. Pat Stepson is over there. Make sure you stay on track and everything. And thank you to the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center for hosting us, of course, and conspiring with us to make sure that this happened. If you're wondering if you're in the right place, this is the first session of the first class of the Urbana-Champaign Strike School. A friend of mine asked me why we have to have a strike school. He said, do you really have to teach people how to not show up to work? I said, well, okay, that's a point. But what the intent is for us to all do it at the same time. And when we come back to work, we want to have a raise waiting for us. So, believe it or not, that requires some thought and some analysis and some planning, and we're going to talk about that, and we hope that you're going to help us talk about that today. So we have a wonderful panel here. Unfortunately, Justice Furtado couldn't be here, so you're going to have to hear from me again. I'm going to fill in for him. We have folks here who have led strikes, who have studied strikes for years, who have led drum lines, who have led picket lines, who have made signs, made puppets, everything to do with a strike. So you have a lot of experience here in this town, and that's why we're having this here, actually. So that's the good news. The bad news is there's no graduating from this class. There's no certificate or anything. We're all still learning. Even the folks who are up here have been doing this for years, and the labor movement's been doing this for hundreds of years, and we're still learning. So you can do that with us. Just a few things before we get started. I was asked to update folks, and maybe other folks who've been involved with the encampment on campus may want to jump in briefly also. The situation on campus is quite complicated. There are 5 bargaining units, 5 contracts that are being negotiated currently, 3 different unions. The MTFC, Sean's union is one of those. There are 2 contracts that AFSCME has and 2 that SEIU, the union I work for, are all bargaining at the same time. So those are 5 potential strikes, or possibly one big one, potentially this year. And just to give you a flavor of how likely that might be to happen, if you don't know, inflation over the last 4 years was 20%, and we've told the university that. Also, there was a study, it was a U of I study, actually, showing that state university employees are making 21% less than workers doing the same jobs in other state agencies in Illinois, 21%. So we told all the university all of this, and their response was they offered us 1% raise. So I don't think any of us are happy at the moment. At the same time, there is a crackdown, I'm sure you know, nationwide against protests on campus. There is an encampment here on the UIUC campus, I'm sure you know. 2 of our leaders at SEIU got arrested this weekend at ISU as part of a sit-in there, all to do with the war that Israel is prosecuting against the people of Palestine. What some of you may not know is that some building service workers, which we represent, SEIU, were asked to go with police last Friday morning, a week ago Friday, to clear away the encampment, tents and other folks' belongings. They were not told that that was what they were being assigned to do before they got there. They found out when they arrived what they were being asked to do. 2 of them refused to participate. There were 4 left who did it, 3 of whom called either me or Justice that morning, just to give you a sense of what was potentially going to happen there. They turned off all of the cameras on the quad and the alma mater at 8 a.m. before the police moved in. So it's a potentially very dangerous situation. We don't know what was about to happen. The least of our concerns was still important. This is not a building service worker job. They don't even pick up trash in that area. It's outside on the grounds. It's not in a building. It's potentially unsafe as well. And moreover, just as our lawyer said to the university in the cease and desist order that he sent them, if you're going to suppress people's right to free speech and protest, if you have to do that, leave us out of it. It's a potential threat to all of us, and I think it's relevant to talk about it here because all of us protest, even if we don't strike. We need to be where people are to have those protests so they hear us. But a strike is more than just not showing up to work. It's loud, it's picketing, and it's potentially disruptive, a lot more disruptive than some tents on the quad. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, anybody else who's been involved with the encampment, but I'll shut up for now.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. The energy around the encampments continues to grow. We've had a lot of amazing support from RSOs, faculty organizations, not just here but in other spaces. We've even had political officials come and do press conferences at the encampment. Those of us within the faculty have spent a lot of time protecting the students as well as organizing others. So again, the support has grown over the past week and a half that this thing started. I can't speak on specifics because there are some things moving, but can't talk about those things, but just need to know that the support that you all can also bring by just going there, and even if you're just talking and speaking with the protesters, bringing supplies, just things like that. They have a lot of food, but any supplies are useful, and just keeping that energy going, especially now that they're getting ready to get into finals week. There's going to be a lot more pressure for them to move on or just to kind of balance certain things, and seeing you all and getting that kind of encouragement, like, hey, we're here with you, that's something that really boosts their morale as well as their capacity to continue doing it. So, but their energy's there, and we're just so proud of everything that they're doing, and we're right there next to them. So
I'll just say that I was there on Friday evening, kind of right after this happened, but they called off, I think actually there was 6 police departments there on Friday night, I bring that up partly to say, at the same time, these sort of another parallel thing that's happening is the city of Urbana is considering hiring 15 more police officers, and that, as a result of pulling all 6 police departments to watch a peaceful protest happen, the 5K was canceled because they couldn't do the 5K without the police, and the police had a very important role to watch the peaceful protesters. If you're, just a couple of things to keep an eye out for, the IMC and others are involved in organizing for alternatives to policing in Urbana. We expect a petition to come out sometime this week to also just raise awareness on kind of what the Urbana city budget looks like, and why we think there are better uses of money. And then if you're interested in being a community observer, we've sent that sign up. I think that's still going, and feel free to come talk to me. We can get you on that if you're interested in doing a shift and just kind of helping observe and build that community university solidarity.
All right, thanks. Well, I think we better get started. We're running a little behind already, of course, as always the way we start out. So we got, first we have Jim. I'm not going to introduce everybody because there are sheets over there with their bios, so please have a look at those.
Okay.
Take it away, sir.
Okay. I want to start with an observation that everybody knows at some level, but maybe we don't talk about enough. It has to do with the motivation for strikes, and for good reasons. We're usually talking about a few more dollars a day or something about work rules or whatever. And I did want to remind people that this is the characteristic form of working class protest. Many working people and poor people have no other recourse. It's often a defense against oppression and an assertion of one's, or in this case a group's, humanity. Sometimes strikes are even political in general. In other words, they're not just for some kind of a financial settlement, they're to actually produce political change. So what I wanted to do first is tell you what happened, quote unquote. In other words, to talk just a little bit about the history of strikes in the United States. So this is 150 years of American strikes in 3.5 minutes. Another thing that maybe we don't think about enough is the United States historically, not so much recently, but historically is strike prone. People might otherwise think of various European societies and also developing societies as more kind of characteristic of strikes. The United States has always been characterized by very high levels of strike activity. Why is kind of interesting. I won't go into any detail, but if you think about the corporate structure in the United States and the policies that corporations follow, that helps to explain why there's so many strikes. So in the late 19th century, sort of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the early 20th century, there's what people at the time talked about as an epidemic of strikes. Some of these you know a lot about. So Haymarket, Pullman, both of which, not coincidentally, are Illinois strikes. They're basically Chicago strikes, and then they spread. These are huge strikes. They're also sympathetic strikes, what Eugene Debs, the great socialist leader, called the Christ-like behavior of sympathy strikes. In other words, he was talking about people who are not directly involved in this conflict, but are willing to go out in support of somebody else. That big sort of upsurge lasts through the World War I period and through 1919. That's a big, if we had a graph, 1919 would be way up at the top. A lot of general strikes that year. Some people may know about the Seattle strike. You may not know about the Springfield, Illinois general strike, which was in 1918. Started with the streetcar workers, but then the miners came marching in from the bituminous fields, and workers really had control in Springfield for a while. There were 4.5 million people on strike in 1919, and that figure in itself won't mean anything to you, but if you compare it, I think Gus is going to talk a little bit about the strike wave in the last year or 18 months. And just by comparison, 4.5 million people on strike in a population that was much smaller. Last year's strike upsurge, which we were all encouraged by, was 450,000. So this movement was 10 times the size. This movement, not too surprisingly, was crushed in the period after the First World War and extending through not just the 1920s, but also the early Depression period, the early 1930s. Strike activity was very low. This is the period of an open shop campaign. This is, some historians talk about it in neutral terms. The labor movement was attacked and destroyed by corporate forces. This is also the period of the Red Scare. So the brain, if you will, of the labor movement, the left wing of the labor movement was really cut off. So there's reasons that we get these declines. And then people probably do know that there's another upsurge now. It begins in the mid-1930s, and it lasts, it might have lasted longer, but there was a no strike pledge during the Second World War. And it's the 1930s, the late 1930s strike wave that produces the giant industrial unions in the United States. These were much more militant unions. They engaged in a lot of strikes. In the period right after the war, for example, 1946, everybody's on strike. So if you went down the industries in the United States, railroad workers, meat packing, steel, electrical manufacturing, building, everybody was on strike. As usual, there are reasons for this. There was a lot of inflation during the Second World War. People were trying to catch up. Cost of living was rising quickly. And what do? You organize and you strike to try to get better conditions. So, right in that period, I just checked the strike statistics for the 1950s, when and I think most people, would have assumed that they would be down. They're not. They're actually very high in the 1950s. There's a giant steel strike that really sort of closed the whole industry. And this is in the period, just to remind people, of Taft-Hartley, McCarthyism, the attack on the left-wing unions. So even in that situation, there was a lot of strike activity. The limits to this, in other words, how far American workers are usually willing to go and how far they're not willing to go, is something that would be great to talk about. I won't go into any detail. Politically, the characterization that the labor movement has been fairly conservative is oversimplified, but there is something to that. So they've been militant on the industrial front economically. They really have been, historically at least, fairly moderate. That seems actually to be changing. So the guy that's famed, the guy that's head of the UAW, talks about class. And he talks about auto workers as part of the working class. And that's a big breakthrough. I think we need to do that more. So finally, there's an upsurge again. It had gone down sort of in the 60s, an upsurge again in the 70s. So again, to give you kind of a benchmark, as late as 1971, there were 3 million people on strike. And so again, this good year that we just had, 2023, is 450,000. So we need to be encouraged by what happened last year. And Gus may straighten me out on this, but you have to put it in context. We're just beginning to come back a little bit. Last year's strikes are dwarfed by the big years in the past. So finally, there's a huge drop. I would say it's not too much to say that the strike as a form of protest just about disappeared in the United States in the 1980s and really going into the 90s as well. Won't go into detail. That's the period of the air controller strike. It's the Reagan administration. And when we talk a little bit about the political dimension here, it would be nice if it didn't make a big difference. It does make a big difference. So the National Labor Relations Board, for example, between 2016 and 2020 was essentially taken apart. It had very little funding, and so that means workers are unprotected. And what happens then when you organize is you're fired, and you don't have recourse if you can't go to the National Labor Relations Board. If I could put in a slight plug for the liberal Democrats out here, Biden seems to have just reconstituted the National Labor Relations Board. There's funds going back into it. He's taken an interest in that, and he's made colossal, I don't even know if mistakes is the right word, in the Middle East and what's happening in Gaza. All of that is true, and some people will not vote for him as a result of that. That's his fault. I did want to remind people that domestically, at least from a labor perspective, he's been pretty good, actually. He's helped in a number of ways. So I'll finish up now. So this brings us to what maybe Gus will talk more about, 2023. And that was an upsurge. I mean, I didn't mean to diminish what happened. If you take 2022 and you compare it to the number of strikes in 2023, that's a 280%, almost a tripling of the number of strikes. So this is indeed an upsurge, and a lot of people with politics similar to mine, for example, are hoping that that's really the beginning of something. Okay, so I was asked about lessons, and I'll end with that. One lesson here, if you look at these statistics, I would not suggest it, but you know, if you did look at these statistics over a period of time, there's a lot of variation, and there are upsurges and there are collapses, and it's important to understand both. I think mostly we talk about what works and how we should organize, and I think that that's very important, but it doesn't always work. There's I would say at least as many defeats in American strikes as there are victories, and it's important to know why those took place. Creativity and initiative is also important. So what I mean by that is, if you have a strictly economic and maybe even a political explanation for why you have successful strikes and a lot of strikes during a certain period, and a political and economic explanation for why it goes back down again, I think you'll miss some things. So a good example is in the period that I mentioned in the late 1930s. That's the period some people will know of the sit-down strike. That's a breakthrough in terms of strike strategy. There really is such a thing as strike strategy, and if you want to win, and if you don't want to win, you shouldn't bother going on strike. If you want to win, there are strategies that you need to develop. And the sit-down strike was brilliant. And just one more that is more recent is rolling strikes. And that's, oversimplifying, that's basically what the UAW did. And that crippled a lot of the auto corporations and helped to win the strike. So politics are very important. As a younger man, I used to be a syndicalist, which meant I thought everything was at the point of production, and you know, if you just get enough strikes, you'll be able to change everything. I really don't believe that anymore. I'm afraid politics is actually kind of important. We need a government. It doesn't even have to be pro-labor, quote unquote, as long as it's not continually attacking the labor movement. And this makes a difference. I've been alluding to the federal level, but even at the local level. So I lived part of my life in Chicago, and I would say this about Champaign, Urbana as well. I don't know what your opinion is, but Chicago is a real labor town. It's not always easy, but it's rather easier, to conduct strikes in Chicago. And that has something to do with the local government, and it has more to do with the strength of the labor movement and the solidarity between unions. So local government, even local government, is important. Recently, what's happened in the United States, and this is another lesson, if you will, is new people have come into the labor movement. And there was an old theory that immigrants, for example, well, first they said this about women workers. And then women workers got organized, and there were huge women's strikes and so forth. So that generalization was retired. And then they said it about immigrant workers. You probably know this, but the cutting edge of the labor movement in a lot of places today is immigrant workers. So Latino workers tend more to be a bit more militant, maybe, than the sort of middle of the working class population. And I'm ending here on the obvious point, which is that solidarity is crucial. As I said, our town and our campus, I'm sure it doesn't feel like it to people that are trying to negotiate contracts and so forth, is pretty good, actually. With the exception of my one failure, which is the faculty, the regular full-time tenure track faculty at the University of Illinois, they're not organized. Just about everybody else is. They're not organized yet. Yeah, they will be organized. So our labor coalition, and especially, I should say, the Graduate Employees Organization, these outfits are very good about supporting other unions. I think GEO never met a strike it didn't like. So the administration's proposals, which Ricky just alluded to, you know, if you want to avoid strikes, and I think most people that have been through a long strike realize how traumatic it is. I think most people want to avoid strikes. Then do the right thing. You know, don't offer 1% wage increases. That's not going to happen in this town and on our campus. What's going to happen, if they stick to that, is that there'll be a strike. And if history is any indication, the unions will win that strike. They've won most of them in the past and gotten more or less what they wanted. And so I think solidarity in that situation, if we face it in the next few months, is really crucial, and I hope people will follow through. So if I was to leave you with anything, it's that when you strike, again, it's seldom for another $1 or $2 a day. It's often a way to assert your rights and object to a lack of respect. The 1% offer is an indication of something. It's a lack of respect for these workers. And in that situation, you have to fight. Try to fight back. So that's basically the history. It might have been 11 minutes instead of 10 minutes, but it's a lot of history. So
Appreciate that. Gus, do you want to believe you're up next? You can use that.
Oh, okay, all right.
All right. So, I mean, you know, I'm appreciative of Sean Fain, but let's, you know, I think that he saw the 2018 GEO strike, which did the rolling strike strategy first, you know. Just saying, you know, I think, you know, he's keeping an eye out on our strikes. But no, I kid and jest. You know, I do want to point out something that ties into Jim's original point in talking about the current issues of why strikes have now started to grow again, is that there is a dialectic between the political economy, the shifting of what's happening in the conditions of our work, and the capacity and the urgency to strike. And so when you look at the period that Jim brought up in the 1980s, when you did see this fragmentation of the labor movement in different ways, you had the deindustrialization of the spaces, which also brought about the depletion of resources for organizing in working class neighborhoods. You saw the loss of recreational centers, you saw the loss of funding, you saw the loss of church support, you saw different spaces and social institutions that really challenged our capacity as union organizers to use the public spaces that we used to use, because most of those areas were privatized and organizers were locked up, things had, etc. So there was this kind of depletion, and it goes into the 80s and 90s. But what's also interesting is that 2018 comes along. And 2018, you had this group of teachers in West Virginia who were up against one of the most anti-union spaces in the country, and they went on a wildcat strike. And so that wildcat strike lasted 13 days. It was over raises, but it was also over something that galvanized the rest of the country, healthcare. That these teachers were adamantly opposed to the ways in which the West Virginia government was taking into consideration their necessity to access health care. And that became a rallying cry, because a few months later, you had the Los Angeles teacher strike, you had the Oklahoma teacher strike, you had Tennessee, you had multiple states of teachers who were coming out, and they were, many of them going on wildcat strikes. And so to kind of tie into what's been happening recently is that you have, as Jim mentioned, a high percentage of strikes coming back, but many of them have been unorganized wildcat strikes or unofficial wildcat strikes. And again, a lot of it ties into the fact that this is about the resource deprivation that has occurred in many spaces. I mean, when we decided to go on strike in 2018, much of it was around the conditions our members had. It wasn't that we were strike happy and all these other things that they put out about us. The idea was that we had members who were sleeping in cars. I myself was only making $13,000 a year before taxes as an assistant at the university. People like myself had my car repossessed. People were couch surfing in different spaces. I mean, there was a literal hunger happening amongst the workers of people. And again, their idea to say these are just a bunch of rich graduate students. These are, you know, they're spoiled. They have the privilege of being here. They don't need anything. Well, again, it wasn't just us, because we had such an amazing group of people who were out there collaborating with other grad worker unions and other blue collar unions who were all talking about, yeah, this is the moment that if we don't seize control over our contracts, not just to get a raise, not just to protect tuition waivers, but to actually assume decision-making power over how our labor is used, then we're going to continue to decline as not just a labor movement, but just as worker power. And so we took it upon ourselves, as well as others who you're going to see, I'm going to talk about in a second, to actually try to put labor on our backs to say we're going out until we get what we need. And we were ready to stay out for 3 months. Now I can say that now that it's been 6 years. But yeah, we had planned internally to stay out all the way through summertime into the fall semester. We had strike loans planned out. We had a GoFundMe that had raised a ridiculous amount of money. We had the support of multiple blue collar unions like the Teamsters, etc., who said, whatever you need from us, we got you. Because we told everybody that this is going to be the make or break. We are going to stay out until we win a progressive contract that gives power to the people that make this university run. And again, it was not just about us as individuals. We understood that there was not going to be access to stable education or stable labor if we didn't put our foot down and try to create a foundation that if you're going to come here, you're going to get stable education and stable labor, because the people here have the power over how we do our work, because we make the university run. And as you go into 2019 and 2020, you have the prison strike at the end of 2018. In 2019, you have the similar situations that go into 2020 with the general strikes of 14 million non-union workers walking off the job. The clowns in the media called it the Great Resignation, because they wanted to depoliticize what the people were doing. But they left signs in the windows that said, union now, capitalism is hurting us, health care for all. They left all these big statements and demand lists, and they organized in neighborhoods. They created a new resource in communities that are going to lead to what Jim was talking about, this upsurge in 2022 and 2023, because a lot of those workers who went on that general strike went into unionized industries or went to unionized other spaces like Starbucks. So again, you have the creation of a local movement center out of a wildcat strike that was unorganized by over 14 million people. And then what did you see happen to the industry of restaurants, etc.? Costco, Walmart, all these restaurants said, we're not going to offer you $8 an hour anymore because of that strike, that you can't go into those places asking for a job without getting at least $16 an hour, just off of less than a year of a wildcat strike. And so when you go into 2022 and 2023, those kinds of instances, including the George Floyd protests, are going to really energize unionized workers. Warrior met coal industry, 2-year strike, because they were not given the things that they were promised in the previous contract cycle. You have more teacher strikes. You have the Nabisco strike. You had the near railway worker strike, which I'll talk about when we do Q&A, because there are a lot of lessons from that, because it was almost busted by Congress. But the point is that, and I'll end here because I want other people to have a chance to speak, that there was a necessity of resources through social institutions that were previously deprived because of the late 70s and early 80s backlash to the labor insurgency, to Black Power, Brown Power, all these social movements that were happening at the time. And so a reclaiming of these resources by the workers, building social institutions, having this new base of organizers who took it upon themselves, in whether wildcat or organized union strikes, to take hold and say, no, we actually can build our resources and we can do more. But as Jim alluded to, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It wasn't good enough because a lot of those members are still not unionized, or they're still seeking to organize other spaces. So there's a lot that we have to constructively critique so that we can get stronger, but we are on the verge of something, I call it infra-political moment that leads to the coalescence of a new, what I call a neo-labor movement. We're not there yet, but there is something emerging that having spaces like this to talk about these things can build power and can offer resources to those who were seeking to organize their spaces, not just for labor, but for our communities in general. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Gonna switch gears a little bit to the on-the-ground strikes. You want to talk to Miriam?
Sure. All right, well, I'm not a labor historian, so indeed, yeah, we're going to switch gears. My name is Miriam Larson. I grew up here in Urbana, and my role is to talk about the 2009 GEO strike. I was a temporary staffer during that strike. I'd been away to college in Minnesota, moved back here, and got hired on in the fall of 2009. I also want to talk a little bit about kind of the arts and labor, so I'm just going to sprinkle that in a little bit, but I wanted to sort of start with an overview. And I also want to just say, like, I really appreciate you all coming out for this event. I'd like to see us do more events like this at the IMC. I think this moment to reflect, to sort of figure out what those lessons are, and also just to sort of revisit these stories. I hadn't thought about and really looked at what happened in 2009 in quite a while. So thank you to Google for keeping all my emails from 2009. Here's a little bit about what happened. So in 2008, the GEO started organizing and got together their sort of the long process of figuring out what is it that our members want. And in let's see. Well, and so I got hired in September of 2009, and so that's sort of the part of the story that I know the best. They've been bargaining for quite a while at the point at which I came in, and we're sort of starting to prepare for a strike. The strike started November 16th of 2009 and was about 2 days, so that strike was really quite short. And sort of coalesced around tuition waivers, so guaranteeing tuition waivers for graduate students. They also offered it had some other wins, including 2 weeks of unpaid parental, or an additional 2 weeks of parental leave. It was unpaid, but something. An increase in the university's contribution to healthcare premiums, upped from 50% to 75%, and raises to the minimum salary that totaled 10% over 3 years. So those were sort of the 2009 strike wins. But as someone in 2009 who's pretty new to the labor movement, I think I was really taken by the amount of organizing, right? And really what does that look like? When I came in, a big part of my role was to increase membership numbers. The GEO in particular has this challenge of really high turnover. So getting new people to sign cards, even though they're part of the bargaining unit, will be improved by, whose working conditions will be improved by the wins of the bargaining team, a lot of people either just don't know that they're part of a union or haven't had the opportunity to be in a union before, quite honestly. So there's a lot of just like labor education and sort of, hey, do you know that you could sign a card? That I did, and so myself and I was part-time, and 2 other full-time workers just had a lot of organizing conversations that year to increase the numbers of enrolled members. And then, you know, as the strike neared, you know, all the spreadsheets and plans that go into it, the strike committee was incredible, and really, you know, sort of delegating everything from, and I'm reminded of this seeing the encampment happen right now too, you know, breaking down observer times, which, you know, during the strike might be breaking down, you know, who's going to be, and offering signups for who's going to be at what building at what time, figuring out who's bringing the water or who's bringing the food. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to this, and then like, you know, if you're just hanging out on campus, occupying a space essentially, you know, what keeps it interesting? And I think that's really where the arts came in. And as I was looking back at my notes, Will Hope was one of the Stewards Council leaders, and he was an ethnomusicology PhD student at the time, so he and I worked quite closely together on this drum corps. And, you know, I'm looking at his notes about the launch of the strike on November 16th. And so an email on November 15th, he sort of outlines some visions for sort of everyone arriving on campus for the start of the strike. I mean, and it's such a musician's way of looking at it, because it's really a performance, right? I mean, there is an aspect of performance there. So, you know, he talks about the location, which way should the speakers face? How is sound going to be amplified? You know, for those of you who were there yesterday, like a bullhorn makes a huge difference from someone just standing up there and shouting, right, to having a bullhorn. You know, and he's talking about that we had a portable amp and mic, but the wind blows, right, and then it's harder to hear. Preparing for rain. The first day of the strike, I think it was terrible weather. It was November, it was cold, it was rainy. So, you know, everyone came with rain gear, or the GEO kind of brought a whole bunch of rain gear. But you know, aside from those kind of considerations, you know, the wind was a consideration for kind of how the performance was going to unfold. Fortunately, the drums that we used were generally 5-gallon buckets, and those even larger kind of water coolers that you turn upside down and people can order, those had a nice bassy sound. So we would have the buckets and the bassy sound, and then usually kind of as the drum corps grew over the course of the semester, also some folks in the music department, one person brought a snare, so you get a little bit of that higher timbre. We made shakers out of water bottles. And I think we got a bass drum at some point too, whether it was constructed out of a garbage can or someone actually had a bass drum, I can't recall.
We still have it.
Oh, good. Excellent. But, you know, we practiced too, right? So I found an email then from someone else on the Stewards Council, which is just a really sweet moment of gratitude too, especially, this is from someone on the strike committee, who writes to say, I just wanted to write you and tell you how awesome the drum corps was today. You guys are one of the necessary elements to this strike being successful. You guys boost morale, make the picket line fun, and really engage the picket line workers. And I mean, that was really lovely to hear, but I think, as I think too about kind of my own role in that process, it really made me, as someone who's a musician, but a little bit more of an introvert, feel like I had a role in the strike. I knew kind of how I was going to show up, that I had something to offer, and that, I could contribute to the morale and sort of the program of that strike. Maybe we could talk about chants, we could talk about sort of how these things, maybe I'll share this suggested program that Will created. So, open with loud groove number 1, lead into chant number 1. As soon as the groove ends, the designated speaker punches in with the point. Keep it short, 2 to 4 minutes. Chant number 2. And these can be different people, right? So you get more people involved in the program. If a second designated speaker, have them speak here. Chant number 3. Have a designated speaker punch in with how people should make their way to the picket lines, right? So sort of, again, sort of drawing people into the participatory performance that is the strike. And groove number 2, as people disperse. Bullhorns may have to relay messages to anyone who can't hear. Example on the side of the amp where you can't hear because the amp isn't pointing that way. So I'm pretty sure that's basically how it went down that first day. I have really fond memories of that drum corps experience. We still have some of those. I do know that there's still buckets there. I hope that perhaps the strikes this summer might have some drumming. I'd be happy to do that. But sort of, the drum corps was one way I participated in kind of the artistic aspect of that strike. I will also just say that I have one very large puppet I really love and have been sort of reading up. I mean, puppets have this kind of long history of, I know less about their role in the labor movement and a little bit more about sort of their role in other social movements. But I'd like to see more of that kind of creative work, perhaps some rats or some more monopoly businessmen. And then I also just want to give a quick point out to this poster we have up to honor in an artistic fashion one of our labor leaders, Jenny Barrett, and so this summer here at the IMC in the exitway / entryway on the south side, we're going to be making a mural, and Jenny Barrett will be one of the people featured there in portrait. And so again, sort of just remembering artists' role in sort of honoring and carrying on the legacy of people that have played a part. And if you want to learn more or donate to help make that happen, feel free to come talk to me or take a look at that flyer. We've just launched it. This is the first time I'm showing people these sketch drawings, so I'm really excited about it. I think that's all I've got. Probably said too much, but yeah.
Sean, you ready? We're not doing things in chronological order here, but
That's fine. I think we'll be okay, Ricky. So, my name is Sean, and I know some of you from various other things, including campus business and other places. But I'm a non-tenure track faculty member at the university, which is a union that popped out while the tenure track and non-tenure track were forming in the 2010s. The non-tenure track faculty became a union that was about 500 people, or about 700 people now, and the tenure track are still in the process. They'll get there someday. They're working on it. They spoke at a rally 2 days ago. They're doing fine. But one of the things that's important to understand is that the non-tenure track faculty started with much shorter contracts and are less stable, and that's partially by design. That's why they don't have tenure. But also, at many institutions, this is used to suppress a lot of activity. So it's very hard for non-tenure track faculty to unionize or successfully stay unionized. For example, Columbia College just had a very successful strike, but it was 6.5 weeks long, and it almost fell apart like 10 times because it's just incredibly hard for people to sustain. We were on strike in 2016 as part of our first contract negotiation. And the thing I thought I would point to, not to give you the long history of all the things that got us there, but is the way we started to have to think about striking for a particular bargaining unit. Because it actually doesn't work the same for every bargaining unit. This may sound trite, but it is actually quite true. One of the biggest tensions that units run into is that they get advice from units or from national and state affiliates with process stuff they can't actually execute. So, for example, non-tenure track faculty at the University of Illinois, not all of them can actually leave their jobs every day, because some people run research labs that have to stay open. We have about 50 of those in my bargaining unit. So those people actually can't go on strike in the same traditional sense. That doesn't mean they won't do things, but it means they can't walk a picket line because they have live animals in their labs that need supervision. The clinical people who supervise educational training have pre-planned schedules for all of the in-class teaching stuff they do with elementary and high schools supervision, and if they stop doing it, those people don't get their teaching certificates. And those, therefore, even if I might say it would be great for you to go on strike that day, those people won't do it. They just they consider it a professional obligation to go do that work. And so you have to respect that. That's one of the biggest things that we had to come to as a union, is that it doesn't mean everyone walks a picket line every single minute. It does mean you have to craft strike plans that are actually around your membership and what sorts of things will look effective, even if they aren't everybody involved. And this is a really important thing that I think we should highlight, is that it does mean you have to draw in solidarity work. The university gets very concerned when they see a lot of people doing the same thing, which is probably what I would be if I were an administrator, but I'm not, so they do. So it's totally fine to fill your ranks with GEO members who'd like to picket and are available to do so. And the second thing I wanted to highlight is that planning toward work activity really requires education. Lots of people are actually unfamiliar with the mechanics of strikes and also with the purpose of strikes. In the media side of things, there's a sense that it's just there to be agitational for its own sake. And of course, that's part of the execution, is to agitate, but it's to a really specific point. You want to drive bargaining. You want to get settlements, right? You actually want the goals of your contract satisfied in some particular way. So your members all have to know that, which means you have to be on the same page about what you're trying to do. People need to know what the specific goals and how they're tied to the next bargaining sessions are going to work. And they have to have delegated the elements of that. The biggest thing I have helped other unions figure out is you have to have, say, a strike planning committee that has a clear set of things they can make decisions about, right? Because they can't actually make all the decisions, but they need to know, like, are we in charge of getting the megaphones? Is that our job? Are we in charge of talking to police and police come up to this activity? Like, who does what? And another team is probably your bargaining team, and they probably don't overlap very hard because the action people can't go to bargaining. It turns out you can't overcomplicate that. It's really got to be schematic in that sense. I was president during the 2016 strike, and so I would have to go sit in bargaining rooms and then sidebar rooms, then administrative meetings, and then talk to the media, and then go to the picket line at like 3 o'clock, when it was finally out of all of that. And hopefully have enough energy for it. But you know, you have to know who's in charge of those things. When are they going to check in with each other? When are you going to alter plans for weather problems? The 2009 strike, I was actually a graduate student at the time, so I walked that strike. It rained and it was like 35 degrees the first day. It's terrible out there. But you know, we're stubborn graduate students, you can do that sort of thing. If my union is full of people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. They do not want to be out in 35-degree weather on a rainy November day.
Don't tell the administration that.
I would never. Well, I'll tell you guys that. No, I'm always ready to tell them to go out. But so you have to think about, what are we doing about those as a solution? A lot of that is just figuring out who your actual unit is and what they know and need to be prepared for. That's the probably biggest thing that has come from not needing to strike in 2019 when we settled our second contract. We were bargaining at the moment. We also got a 1% offer 2 weeks ago. Very delightful to yell at them about. A lot of bullshit right there. Yeah, and we'll get a lot higher eventually, but it's quite clear that they will push this issue every contract or two, and they're happy not to learn any lessons on their side. So you have to learn all the lessons. Like, you and your unit and your affiliates are the ones that actually figure out how to respond to get what you want, because they're happy to repeat their mistakes. Like, that's quite clear to me, having worked here quite a long time. I think Ricky can attest to this. They will just do the same playbook on their side without seeming to have internalized any of the failures of losing to a strike, paying out. And if that's how they want to handle it, I'm happy to be the side that actually works and makes sure we are educating ourselves about what we're doing. I can answer a ton of practical questions because I've sat in a billion meetings about these things, but I think that that's one of the things that we're really focused on, is that our membership has a clear sense of what this is for, and that it's not just presentational. Right? It's not just there to be on the news every night because the local news is awesome. It's there because we have specific goals about our contract, about some new provision. It's because we actually need it for the stability we're looking for. We've made a list of why we're doing that so that we're not losing track on our side. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
So I'm not Justice Furtado, unfortunately. But I'm going to take his party sick today. I'm going to talk about the UIUC strike in 2013. So we're all out of order here. If you're keeping track, so at that time, the only strike that I think any of us remembered on UIUC, you know, in the last many years was GEO strike in 2009, which was a great inspiration to us, actually. The following year after that, we came close to going on strike, but decided not to at that time. We weren't quite ready, honestly. But in 2013, I believe that what happened was that the university believed that we were not going to strike. The strike I'm talking about is the only civil service hourly strike of the ones that we're talking about up here at the university. And we had not gone on strike. We had pulled out at the last minute 2 years before, and I think the university thought that we were bluffing. We were not. And so we wound up needing to strike. 800 building service and food service workers walked off the job March 11th, 2013. The university declared a civil service emergency. Civil service has a provision to suspend civil service rules in the case of an emergency. As far as I know, it's the first time that had ever been done for a strike. They did that. Their explanation, Robin Kaler was here then, actually. She's a professional liar, but she can occasionally tell the truth. She said, anytime 800 people walk off a job, it's an emergency. So there was, again, the important thing was that it was inspired by the GEO strike in 2009, but also it was different. It was a 24-hour-a-day, round-the-clock strike. People were picketing any hour of any day that you went out there, somewhere on campus, docks, various places on campus, in front of the Atlanta Union, some people saw. So if you were there, you might not have noticed as many people because they were spread out over about 30 locations, all over campus and all 3 shifts. We actually worked 4 shifts of the strike because people picketed for 6 hours at a time. That's one of the things I wanted to mention, the importance of preparing. We're all talking about that in one way or another. Folks had to know where they were supposed to go. At midnight, their foreman was not going to tell them where your picket line is. They needed to know where to go. So they had to sign up. They signed up weeks before. Because up until the last minute, of course, we were still hoping to get a deal. But when the strike came, we needed to be able to just send the word out. We're doing it, midnight it starts, go to your picket line. Of course, some people didn't picket until the next morning, depending on what shift they were on. But people had signed up weeks before. Which brings up another thing I wanted to talk about, was the assessments. Everybody up here is nodding because you can't walk out on strike unless you're pretty sure people are going to do it. You don't want to be on strike with 12 people because you're going to lose every single thing you've won over the last 80 years. So some of our members, we have several members here, some of our folks sometimes ask, I'm sure you'll get asked this question, why are we doing these rallies and packing the house when we're in bargaining? You know, we try to get 50, 75 people to attend bargaining. Why do we do that when, you know, let's just go on strike when it's all over? You can't do that because you don't know if people will participate, A, and secondly, you're putting pressure on the university, whatever your employer is, to increase the offer. So for 2 reasons. One, you might not have to strike. If they believe that you're going to strike, you might not have to. You might get the deal that you want without it. But also, when you go on strike, you're trying to increase several, Jim mentioned that it's not just wages, there are several different things that you'll be trying to achieve in a strike. Could be tuition waivers, various things like that. You want all of those things to be as close as you can to where you want to go before you strike so that you just have a shorter distance to improve to strike. Because you don't want to be out there for a year. You do not. Our strike was only 3 days. It was planned as 3 days. Looking back, I believe that that was a mistake, but we're here to talk about what worked and what didn't work. The plan was actually we were going to strike for 3 days and then go back out if we needed to. Like NTFC went out 2 different times, but in the end it didn't work out that way. So it would have been better if we'd known that to just stay out for as long as it took. We did have some victories I want to mention. So there's the bragging rights and then the regrets section, right? We were the first union on campus to get off of the hated campus wage system. And we have never gone back. The university was so, we say, in our union, I'm sorry, we say butthurt. They have never even tried to put us back onto the campus wage system since then because it was that definitive. That was a system, for folks who don't know, where the university would just give out a certain percentage. That's your wage. And we said, what's the purpose of that? What's the purpose of bargaining if we're going to do that? But I think for many years it had been 3%, 3.5%. People were happy with that. There were a couple of years it was 0. And that was part of what encouraged people to actually walk out on strike to say, we're not doing that anymore. You're going to tell us every year how much our wage is going to be. One of the things, though, I think that we saw with, I think in particular GEO strike in 2018 was escalation. If you were part of that, you know, they went through, you know, they were not just picketing every day and rallying every day, occupying offices, going from one thing to another. They did a brilliant move, I have to say, where they marched to the president's house. While everybody was focused on that, they went and occupied, I think it was the president's office.
So we did Swanland and
Swanland,
Henry.
yes.
2 buildings.
Two different times, right. So there was always something. Every time the university thought that, okay, that's bad, then there was something else coming. And the engineering open house was coming up, I believe. So they were terrified by that. In 3 days, you can't escalate a lot. So that's another reason that I think that it was a mistake. One thing that I'll just mention one last thing that I would do differently in that strike. We did not have a kind of meeting every day or every night of the membership. Folks went to all these different dispersed picket lines and then they just went home and then they showed up again the next day. And there wasn't a set, you could feel quite isolated. I heard from a lot of people, they're like, is anybody else even doing this? Because they were there on the picket line with 5 or 6 people. The last day we had a mass rally and filled the quad, and it was really thrilling to everybody. And we should have done something like that every day. I'll just mention, since I'm talking, I'm sorry, I like to talk. Another strike to just compare to UIC in Chicago. Also we had a strike there in 2020. I just want to mention this one because it was different. There were only 2 locations. There's a hospital there, and there's another smaller campus in a different part of town. And this was in the spring of 2020. Everybody remembers what was happening in the spring of 2020. So it was actually quite frightening. We had set up a bunch of tables to sign people in. The idea was, I was in charge of the main picket line at the hospital. We had prepared for about 200 people to show up when the picket line started at 6 a.m. The plan was everybody would come forward, sign in, put the pen aside. Somebody was there who was going to wipe off each pen. We didn't know how it was spread at that time. And then people would get a t-shirt. We would look them up on our phone, make sure they're a member, check them in, and they would go out to the picket line. And I was trying to get people to stand at arm's length, like this, to try to get, minimize the amount of infection that we were going to happen. So by 5:30 that morning, there were not 200 people there were 800 people in the streets. The cars could not go by. The police are already mad, and we haven't even started picketing yet. Never mind wiping all the pens, that is not happening. The first thing I said was, put your phones down, we don't have time to do that. We're signing people in, what size are you? Take your, and go out there. There's no way that people, if we could have stood at arm's length, we could have reached all the way around the block. But people were not doing that. They were clumped together in a huge mass of people. They were celebrating, they were dancing, they were singing. I thought we were all gonna die. There were some things about that strike that were different also. Because it was a hospital, there was a court order. A lot of people were ordered to go to work because of the position they did. So it allowed the employer to hold out longer. We don't have that with the kinds of strikes we're talking about here. It's very important. It's going to lengthen the strike because it allows the employer to hold out. There was still a very good turnout of people. There was the people who had to go to work could wear these little armbands showing that they were in support, and they could picket when they were not at work. So like Sean's saying, there are other ways that people can participate. Another challenge was that the nurses at the hospital were on strike with us the first week. They had planned only to be out for 5 days. There were about 800 of them. There were 4,000 of us, but our people were terrified that we would lose as soon as the nurses went back in. Even though we were larger, our folks felt like the younger brother, so to speak, or whatever. And the strike, there was a real danger that weekend that the strike would collapse because of just people losing their motivation. So we had picnics and all kinds of things, but it was quite terrifying. But working people will surprise you a lot of times. They were back out there Monday morning, and we picketed for another week, and eventually won the best contracts they had ever had. But there wasn't, I will say, a real escalation plan. So I'm coming back to this theme. There was a lot of picketing. There were more people than we were prepared for. Marched down to, I think it was the Chancellor's house, which is about a mile down the road from the hospital at UIC. But there wasn't really a build-up like what we saw with GEO, where the employer didn't know what was coming next. Until the last day, there was a construction site that we had been eyeing across the street. I should say, I forgot to say, at the UIUC strike here in 2013, it was very important that the construction trades honored our picket lines. They did not go to work. Electricians, plumbers, everything that was broken on campus did not get fixed during this time. It was very important to us, and we will never forget that. At UIC, there was this construction site, building trades folks. They were building some kind of institute. To be honest, I don't remember what it was, but we were told that it was the university's baby. They loved it. It was that, I think some of the administrators would have given up their actual firstborn for this institute they were building. And some of us were asking, why are we not picketing this location? It was a university location, but actually it was good that we did not in the beginning, because it gave us somewhere to go. You see what I'm saying? The last day we showed up at 5 a.m. I won't tell the whole story, although it's a fun story. The construction trades, none of them went to work. The whole site was quiet for the first time in months. And that afternoon, the university capitulated completely. They said, whatever it takes, we don't care, we want a contract, stop doing this to us. And I think it's important to remember that's the goal, right, is to get them to sort of cry uncle. We had to learn the opposite lesson that Sean was talking about. This is the last thing I'll say. For our folks, we have a tendency to think sometimes that the important thing is withdrawing our labor. It's very important. It's very important. But you also have to remember who your employer is. The employer is very sensitive at UIUC to publicity, to embarrassment, And the last time we negotiated a contract, we did not have to go on strike because we threatened to disrupt their quad day. And they revealed their weakness to us. I'm just saying, there's a quad day every year. They're sensitive, there are sensitive points. And at UIC, it was this construction site. But I won't say any more now because I've already talked too much. I hope that you guys will have some thoughts, some questions, maybe a strike that you've participated in, or maybe just one that you wondered about, that you want to either just discuss or talk with some of the panelists for a few minutes here, because we're analyzing here, we're thinking about these things. Should we? Ask a question, well, oh, thank you.
Can I just ask real quick, can you raise your hand if you've been on a picket line? I imagine that we have a lot of experienced folks. Okay, and yeah, how many of you have helped to organize a strike? Just out of curiosity. Okay, so a lot of people who've participated, fewer who have helped organize. Cool, I just wanted to get a sense of kind of who was here.
And actually, I have another question. How many people have been on a picket line for someone else's strike? Solidarity. All right.
Actually more,
Yeah.
which is good.
Get on camera for a moment there, Pat. Ricky, I have a particularity, so I'll try and ask a broader question too, but this business about this fixed rate that BSWs were offered, my recollection is that that was supposedly attached to whatever the broad allocation by the state was. And my memory also is the BSW always got shorted on that as it was passed through. And in the period of time that I was there, I'm glad it's gone entirely because it ought to be tied directly. But the more broader question is just the particularity of working as a state worker, university worker, this image of the coddled worker in the state sector that is very, and how you counter that. One of the ways is the statistics I heard at the rally on Thursday was that broadly, many of the workers do not make as much as comparable employees around the state, and yeah, so generally riff on that if you would.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, because I want to lead into yours because just talking about some of the work that I've done. I've been working with the Hollywood unions for the past couple of years on the writers last year for their strike, and now I'm working with the production workers this year in prepping a possible strike. And one of the big things that we've been working on is the fact that the messaging, particularly last year, had to go out that only about 10% of the members of Hollywood unions make over $26,000 a year to even qualify for the health care. So a big part of their push, if you were watching a lot of it last year, and some of it this year as it's building up, is this kind of moving away from the coddle, well, it's a Hollywood elite, this, that they don't really need anything. These are the same people who are rich, they're just wanting more crumbs. It's like, yeah, it's like, that's one of the major things to focus on, and I'll end on this and pass it to Ricky, is that when you look at the coverage of the encampment protests, there's a reason they keep focusing on Columbia, and they're not looking at the state school protests, because they want to portray propaganda that these are only a bunch of elite students at Ivy League schools who are just crying and just being obnoxious, when in fact they won't show all the rest of the protests that are at over 100 schools now. And again, that's a propaganda strategy that we have all had to work through in terms of making sure that our strikes and our messaging reach the general public and could affect everyone.
Yeah, very good point. It's a good question, Paul. I think there is a perception in the community that, everybody who works for the university is pretty much doing okay. I think we've got a few unions up here who could talk about that. For us, I think, as Paul, and other folks here who are building service workers and also food service workers, it almost writes itself. It's true that for the work they're doing, they probably get paid a higher pay per hour than doing that work somewhere else. But number one, they've been fighting for that for 80 years. The message should be, you too can fight for that and you can have a better pay. But also, it raises, just the economics of it, when you have a group of workers who are able to earn more for a certain task, it raises the expectation for everybody else. Everybody else's wage for doing the same job tends to go up because some people have improved their wage. But it's not just that. Food service workers, for example, most people don't know, get laid off 4 times a year. There are 3 months in the summer, 3 weeks at the winter time, a week around Thanksgiving and a week around spring break. That's time when they do not get paid. They have to pay their own health insurance, and they are not eligible by state law for unemployment. So it's a desperate time. People lose their cars, they lose their phones, they have to move. It's a very serious situation. It's one of the things that we're finally making a little headway on in this negotiation, I think. It's not just economic, or not just pay. Our folks they do dangerous work. Kitchens are dangerous. There's a lot of vats of boiling liquid this big. Floors are slippery. There's a lot of sharp knives. BSWs clean everything. They have to go in to clean excrement off of walls where people have smeared it, blood also. They have to remove that. They find dead bodies on campus. They find fetuses in toilets. They have to lift extremely heavy filing cabinets that people do not empty before they move them. Huge oaken desks, those old-fashioned, wonderful desks. Not great if you're trying to move them up a small spiral staircase. People get hurt constantly. We've had folks who were ordered to go outside and wash windows, 3rd floor windows with those long aluminum poles while there's lightning outside. Those things are full of water, just so you know. They go over to the president's house, and every year they have to take the windows out and clean them and put them back in. They've been sent over there with ladders that only have 1 foot on the bottom, and where, because of the arrangements, it's impossible to have a safe angle of them. And when you challenge them, the foreman says, I don't care what he says, you're going up the ladder. Well, no, you're not. You're in a union and you're not going up that ladder. But it's very important for people to hear about these things. And everybody up here could tell similar stories about how there are a lot of good things about working at the university, but it's not the being carried around on a cushion like you might think.
Can I add one quick thing?
Yeah.
So one of the things we do a lot is member testimonial business that reveals specific predicaments. For example, one of my colleagues has to sell plasma because he does not have enough to pay his rent, and he is still considered a pretty good position because he's a faculty member at a university, especially the University of Illinois. And you end up with these interesting complications. For example, we stabilized a bunch of titles and people's long-term stability. So like half of our bargaining unit actually has the term professor in their title now. I do. It's like a humorous byproduct. But then you have to explain to people that that actually doesn't come with some of the things the word professor actually comes with, right? It's not as though I got a 10-year contract or have tenure. It just happens that my title now is better and I do have more stability. But then you are the sort of locus of that explanation. So finding specific examples of what it is to actually do the kind of work we're trying to improve cuts through the easy perception part of it. We do a lot of that now, so like our Facebook and Instagram or stuff are full of our particular member stories. That's what I'm not in charge of that, by the way, so I just watch that happen. But it's obvious, I think, as a helpful matter of the experiential side of being a unionized person, is that actually you still don't fix everything at the same time. Or that stuff is still always there somehow.
Hello, I have two small questions, if that's okay. So I'm an undergrad student, and I think I'm relatively new in the labor movement. So my first question is, how do you stay motivated? And secondly, what can us undergrads do to best show our support?
Nice.
So I wouldn't mind taking a crack at the second one. Because unlike the other people up here who have actively been involved in planning and carrying out strikes, my union, I worked on it for 40 years, but the faculty at the University of Illinois are still not recognized. We did have a union and we had a substantial membership. So the reason I mention that is I think there's actually a lot of different things that can be done. One thing that might have been implicit in what Ricky had to say, but I don't think he mentioned it specifically, is to share picketing. So I think that that's generally helpful. In other words, if during the GEO strike, there were faculty that took part in the picketing with the graduate employees. But the undergraduate students in particular,
Yes.
yeah, I think that everyone notices, and that really sort of raises the spirit of the people on strike. So that's one thing. A second thing, which the undergraduates, I think, unless you're independently wealthy, are less likely to be able to do, but our union could do, because we had no contract, but we had a substantial treasury. So what we did was give money to the people out on strike, and that helped them get by. In the service employees strike that Ricky talked about, it was only 3 days long, but as he explained, some of these people are very close to the bone. In other words, they have barely enough income to sort of get by. And so in that case, I remember we collected a lot of food and distributed that. And the last thing, which does come back to the undergraduates, something that could be done, is publicity in all its different forms. So it's important that the other unions, and I guess other organizations on campus, make explicit statements. The union is right, the administration is wrong. The administration should be coming through on this. But also letters to the editor. Believe it or not, a lot of people still read the News Gazette. And one of the things we would do is sort of line up maybe 10 people who were willing to write letters. So you write a letter this time, you write a letter that time, you write a letter this time. Pretty soon, you've got a whole bunch of letters supporting the unions. These things, in some ways, I'm glad you asked the question, in some ways they're less important than these strategic things that everyone has talked about. But actually, I have to say, I think they do make a difference. I think they help the unions that are out on strike. And what was your first question?
How do you stay mobilized as inspired?
Yeah, somebody else can probably answer that better than me.
I'll say one quick thing and pass to Gus. I'm stubborn and very stubborn, and I just do things until I get fixed. So, like, as you know, I just keep working on it. But one quick thing, just as a practical matter, we were out on strike for 4 days over sort of 2 consecutive blocks, and at the beginning, we weren't sure how to actually talk to undergrads directly, just like they're there, but what do you do? And we had a few motivated undergrads who were like, we'll just hand out flyers for you. And so we just ran thousands of flyers, just literally. And we had an undergrad at the end of every picket line just handing out flyers to their peers. It literally, we did nothing for that. It just required 10 extra people who were gonna be there sometimes. But that means thousands of your flyers are now in the hands of undergrads walking around, and they kind of know what's going on. And then people wanna stop and talk, you know what to talk to them about. I actually am not positive how to explain everything to a, say, sophomore who just doesn't quite know about union stuff, but an undergrad who kind of is feeling their way and has some explanatory language. But being really stubborn, I'm a big fan of this, just to get it.
I'll just add that in the 2009 strike, there was an undergraduate-graduate alliance that was formed that did some of that same sort of work and also surfaced some labor issues that student workers, undergraduate student workers, were struggling with. But I was on staff just coming out of undergrad when I joined staff for the GEO, and I think for me as a student activist, also like coming into labor and really seeing sort of the long, incredibly long social justice history was like incredibly inspiring. And also, you know, the sort of structure of an economic sort of bargaining power that, you know, previously I've been involved in some anti-racism organizing and some sort of education justice work as an undergrad. And I think, you know, but also like coming out of this moment of like kind of identity politics and, you know, I kind of came to labor as a way to kind of find a different route through the nonprofit industry, or kind of not just go into the nonprofit industrial complex. I think like as a motivated young person who was like, you know, passionate about sort of social justice issues, like, you know, there's a lot of ways to do that, and I think labor has this kind of incredibly long history of kind of structured, bargained justice that was really intriguing to me, and that wasn't sort of in the hands of, you know, grants and donations and sort of privatized nonprofits, and so, you know, I was really thinking about it. It's like, okay, well, in any job that I do as a graduate, I'm going to be a worker, right? I don't have to kind of get a job in a nonprofit in order to do social justice work. Like, in any job I'm going to do, I'm going to be a worker. And what are my working conditions? How can I think about those critically? I feel like, you know, the way the media, I don't know, I'm sure someone could say this more eloquently than me, but there's sort of this like social justice stuff, right? But I think the labor movement was a way for me to come back to like, oh, justice is in every sort of piece of our lives, and in the way we're treated in our everyday, and sort of, and how our labor is compensated. So I don't know where that fits in, but I think that sort of was to some degree what motivated me, and also just like seeing, like, I grew up as a middle class white person, like I had a lot of privileges growing up, and so it was another way to just kind of listen for what are the equity issues that other people are experiencing that are different or similar to what my family experienced, but that aren't like, so, you know, what do you think about social justice? Which is just not a way to start a conversation with a lot of people who haven't gone to college, I don't know, who aren't sort of in that like cool club of social justice-y kind of conversation folks. I'm not being particularly articulate about this, but I think there's sort of a fundamental sort of connection to like the way we live our lives that's part of the labor movement, and really, you know, that we come and go from as parts of our lives come and go, or sort of as eras of our lives come and go. But yeah.
I see you, Pat. Do you mind if I add one thing to this question that's specific? I'm really glad for this question because I think there are a lot of ways that undergraduates have helped. We had actually the year before the 2013 strike, the contract before 2011, we partly won that and did not have to strike because an undergraduate took some of our flyers and went into one of the dining halls and stood up on a table and we didn't ask him to do this, made an announcement and was giving out flyers and got himself arrested on the front page of the Daily Atlantic. Big mistake on the university's part, by the way. It was basically over at that point. A picture of him being taken away by the police in handcuffs like this. But we've had a lot of folks picket with us. Jim mentioned folks bringing food, brought donuts, pizzas, coffee, all kinds of things out, and just picket with us. Just picket with us. You can also call the chancellor's office or email the chancellor's office, things like that. But the support of undergraduates has always been really important to some of these things. And I'll stop here.
So the most important thing that undergraduates can do is to be a part of building this kind of neo-labor movement that I kept bringing up earlier, in that there are a ton of leverages of power that undergraduates possess at the University of Illinois that you can tap into. One of them being, of course, working with other RSOs and organizations, creating panel discussions, celebrating the history of labor or other social movements on campus, so that you're building political education foundations across the area, and they can be around different topics, similar to what the YMCA does in terms of their Friday Forum series. Undergraduate organizations can have their own series of either discussions or events that really educate each other on these things. Another thing, of course, is that we have a labor education program, and you all need to really just learn how the power of labor works. And taking those courses, as well as working with the amazing faculty there that can get you involved in whatever you want to get involved in, because again, we're allowed to do those things in that program. And that's, again, another major resource in the labor education program, where we offer those kinds of courses. And again, the very nature of what you do as an undergraduate, very happy to announce that we do finally have an undergraduate worker contract in the United States at Grimley College in Iowa. They just signed their contract. It's the first undergraduate union in the country. Started very small with just a bunch of cafeteria workers, and then started in 2016. They didn't get to the table until 2023, and they got their contract less than a month ago. That's the type of intensity and dedication and commitment that you develop by taking those courses, by holding those consistent events with other undergraduate organizations, by standing up and speaking out when you see any type of violation of human rights on the campus. That creates that consistent dedication and discipline, so that when it does come time to say, hey, it's time for us to fight for more, you're gonna have that bond and that connection to say we're ready to take that risk. So that's how you leverage different parts of power as undergraduates on the campus that is growing in undergraduate numbers every year. And we can talk more about that after we finish.
Pat, seize the time.
Yeah, I'm going to at this point. My name is Pat Simpson, and among other things that I've done over the years, I've been a labor educator. And one thing I learned in labor education is you got to be flexible. Because we had this whole program, we were going to break up groups and talk about the issues as a group, and then report back. Well, given the time frame, that doesn't look possible. So what I'm going to suggest at this point is we have all kinds of food, as you can see. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? And I also want to thank Isabella, because if you see all the wonderful French veggies over there, that came from Isabella, so we have to honor her for that contribution. Jay, Central Illinois Jobs with Justice, also made a contribution of food over there. There's just about every variety of food that you could imagine, so do take some. There's been such a nice flow here that I think what we'll do is we'll take a 5-minute break, we'll come back and continue this kind of discussion. But for all of you, what I'd like you to think about is, what did you learn from this panel today? What have you learned from your own experiences on strike or within unions? And what further questions you might have. So check out the food. Yes?
In my experience, if you take a break, people don't come back. So if you, before we take a break, could tell those of us who are willing to do something on a very remote capacity, what we could do.
What kind of support
What kind of support
could be offered?
Miriam
Okay.
said something about being an observer or witness, whatever.
Well, there are going to be a lot of picket lines. We mentioned that. I also mentioned that, the chancellor's email address is, unfortunately for him, is online. I think it's just chancellor. It's chancellor at illinois.edu. But he also has a phone number there. I think contact them, let them know how you feel about what you've heard, and these negotiations that are currently going would help. Also, there's the Jobs with Justice sign up for, in general, sort of support work for other unions. Looks like Brett was raising his hand.
Oh, yes.
Brett, there.
No, Jobs with Justice at the email every year, but basically what we do is we get information from different unions, locals, community groups, And we just put it out in the email so people can actually know what's going on. And we've got NTC, GEO, SEIU, just all in one, so you can keep up, because there's a lot of locals in town. There's like 70 some, I think. It's a lot. Everybody keep track of, so we can strike together.
And then one quick practical thing before food is that since there are 5 locals bargaining at the moment with the university, all of those contracts end in August. So ours ends August 15th, theirs ends August 31st, I believe, and so is ASME. So you'll know pretty soon into May, early June how that's going, because we're not subtle. I'm not subtle. But keep an eye, because those things ramp up pretty quickly, because now everybody's into talking about money for all of those contracts. And you'll get a pretty clear sense how escalatory that's going to need to get.
In practical terms, just so you know, Gus talked about some wildcat strikes, and I think those are great. In terms of legally striking in the state of Illinois, all of these unions have to wait until their contracts expire. They have to meet with a mediator, and they have to give at least 10 days notice. Those things are unlikely to happen before August, but that's about the time period you want to probably pay attention. Potentially those things are going to be happening.
All of this has been about unions on campus, and just so it doesn't get left out, I'm thinking of the question that you asked. So there's stuff going on in the community all the time. One concrete example is the teachers' strikes. And my experience is that the teachers always appreciated, parents especially, but also people in the community showing up. And you're welcomed. You know, you don't have to feel sort of marginalized. And for that matter, if I can, I mean, I go to everything, building trade strikes and all kinds of other things. They're always very pleased to see somebody showing up. That's not the only thing to do. There's been other examples. When the teachers are on strike, people need to write in support of the teachers publicly. You know,
Any more pressing questions before we, yeah, Chris. Here, you want me to
I think the choir all agrees that if you work 40 hours, you should be able to afford life. I think it's also criminal to this day that K through 12 teachers don't make 6 figures. And I think we're all in favor of working people making a living. But I'm going to ask, I may be getting off topic, but could you define what inflation means and what cost of living means? And with a specific on the word living, what does that mean? I ask because I'm dealing with the public safety unions who can't strike, and we can't lock them out. But I will tell you, we are in a cycle that's unsustainable, and that is the 3% cost of living adjustment every year for the length of every year of the contract. So at the end of 3 years, the police department got an 11% raise. The end of 3 years, the public works department got their 11 to 12% raise. The fire department got a 6-year contract, at the end of which is an 18% raise. And every time we go to a contract, they want that 3% cost of living adjustment. Don't blame them, but we need to define exactly what that is, because we're going to be asked to raise your taxes very soon. The City Council of Urbana is going to be asked to afford the crooked fire station. That's a whole nother topic, but we're going to raise your taxes. So that's another part of the story.
Can of worms, anybody want to take it?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that any contract that you negotiate as a union or as a worker, no matter what, should either meet or exceed the cost of living and inflation. That's called a progressive contract. That's why when we negotiate contracts, we do price outs and we actually look at how much it's going to cost on an average budget for a person to make an amount of money. So when we define cost of living, we're talking about the capacity to actually be able to pay an average month of bills, while also, from my radical ideology, be able to save a good amount of money as well, so that you can actually do the things that they talked about at Haymarket: 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, and then have money for that 8 hours to do what you will. Different people have different interpretations of that money, but again, when you look at inflation, and I'm not trying to hold everybody up because we have a lot to do, but the inflation crisis right now, if you saw what happened last week with the keeping of the same number for the interest rates, it goes to show you that we're in for a very dangerous year when it comes to pricing. And so with inflation, you actually have price gouging and other elements that capital uses to pull money out of our pockets in the midst of economic instability. And unfortunately, you have levers of power, whether it be in the country or nationally, globally, that can manipulate those levers of power and make us pay extra for things that should not cost those things. The biggest example is the gas prices right now, yet in the past they've used war as a means to propagandize why you're paying more at the gas pumps, but you're not hearing any of that right now when you actually watch the stations. They're just saying, hey, gas is up, you're gonna have to pay more. So again, that there is this really strange manipulation of inflation that unfortunately is gonna cost us if we don't stand up and call for, because you can't have price caps at specific spaces that we've called on multiple presidents to do. So I'll stop there because again, I know we got other things to do because this is a long conversation, but I just want to make sure that we're aware that, yeah, that's a can of worms, but we need to be fighting for progressive contracts.
Any other comments on that one?
I'll say one thing. We usually look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics to answer your question, and that is telling us that over the last 4 years, inflation has been 20%. Our wages have definitely not increased by 20%. So we're playing catch up. One of the big things that we always notice is that, if inflation is relatively low right now, we won't get much of a wage increase, unless we strike or something. And over the next 4 years or 3 years or however long your contract is, sometimes they're longer, we don't know what prices are going to do. So we're locked into those wage increases, and inflation at one point was like 10%.
Yeah.
We, as working people, we had to eat that. That was just money, that was just stuff we couldn't buy. That was food we could not put on the table. That was gas we couldn't put on in the car until the next time we had to negotiate a contract. So yeah, now inflation is 3 point something, but we're playing catch up. So I think it's important that, like I said, these folks, they raise their prices. We have to pay all of that, and then most of the time, we're just trying to get it back. We're not trying to get ahead of it usually. We're trying to get it back. The other thing I'll say is about percentages. We talk about percentages a lot. Now, in my union, we have a tendency to ask for dollar amounts raises, and the reason for that is that we're relatively low wage workers. A percentage raise for someone who makes $100,000 a year is a lot bigger raise than that same percentage for somebody who makes $17,000, $18,000, $20,000 a year. And yet, I pay the same for a gallon of milk that you do, right? So this is what we talk about at the bargaining table. I don't know how much the folks make that you're talking about, and I'm not trying to undermine anybody up here. But our concern is always not necessarily the percentage of raise that we get, but what that translates into in terms of buying power for our workers. We just don't want to lose any money. most of the time.
And just one quick sentence on that, we've been playing catch up since 1982. That was the last time that wages nationally met or exceeded the cost of living in this country because of inflation and other things that have depleted purchasing power, both whether it be union contracts or regular hourly pay scales. So just put that since 1982.
I can make a comment on this too. Years ago, I worked for the Pennsylvania State Education Association. And when I was in training to be able to go, we would present the case. I was with the central headquarters. We would present the case in mediation and arbitration. And one of the things my trainer, a union man, said to me is, you can't negotiate a contract that's going to break the district in terms of available funds. You just simply can't do that. But I think we're talking here about unions largely that have been playing catch up. All right? There are some unions that we could say are a bit more privileged in that regard, and they've been keeping better pace in terms of the cost of living. And that needs to be kept in mind, I think, particularly with some of the public safety workers that you're talking about. And what you need to do is you need to know the finances, and Chris, you've actually been doing a pretty damn good job on this front already. You have to understand the finances of the institution that you're dealing with. You have to look at the history of negotiation. How have these unions been doing thus far? Where does that put them in terms of cost of living increases or not? And also, I think that you just simply have to look at comparable areas, geographic areas. Let's call this middle-sized cities, okay, Urbana, and look at what's been happening with contracts with public safety workers there. And because you may get some good data that says what you're asking for is out of the ballpark, right?
We have that data, and unfortunately, surrounding areas pay better than.
All right, so you don't want to show that kind of data in negotiations. That's one thing you also learn in negotiations. There's some data you use and there's some data that you ignore as much as possible. But I think certainly an argument can be made if the trend has been that they have been getting those cost of living raises, and to get another one is going to put the city at a disadvantage such that they have to raise taxes, that is a counter argument to their wage increases, and to use it as much as possible. So that's one approach that I would suggest. I dare to say public safety workers are, shall we say, a bit privileged workers, relatively speaking. And we won't even go into where they stand on the solidarity question. And this is spoken by a daughter of a cop, I might add. So.
Chicago cop.
Yeah, Chicago cop on top of it. Well, we really are running out of time here, but we have so much food now.
Nobody leaves until all of that food is eaten.
And if it's not